Hey, what's up guys, and today we're going to be comparing two of Canon's RF fast prime lenses, the RF 35mm f1.8 and the RF 50mm f1.8, to see which one is right for you or if you should get both. I'm going to split this video into three different parts: the build quality and design, comparing them both for photography, and then comparing them both for video as well. But first, let's get into the actual design and build quality of these two lenses. Now, it's going to come a little bit obvious that when you put them both together, is the RF 35mm is a little bit bigger than the actual 50mm itself. Not majorly, I'd say quite a big difference when you're actually holding it in your hand, because I must say, when this 50mm is on your camera, it honestly feels like there's no lens on it. The weight of it feels nothing, honestly. The weight of it feels like there's nothing in your hand, and then when it's actually on the camera itself, it feels like you're just holding the camera body. This adds no extra weight at all to your camera bag or to your camera. Now, comparing it to this is very light, I'll say as well, but comparing it to the actual 50mm itself, you can actually feel a big difference in weight, to be honest. This lens here, the 50mm, is coming in at 160 grams, and the 35mm is coming in at 305 grams. So nearly double the weight of the 50mm itself. Now, you can actually tell a difference when both of these lenses are actually on your camera. You can actually feel this is on there, but it does feel nice in the hand. It doesn't feel really heavy at all. It is still light. It's just that this one is super light. But both of them feel really nice in the hand when they're actually on the lens itself. Now, the reason why this is nearly double in weight, because it's got two main features that the RF 50mm doesn't, and it's also got a design feature as well. So, as you can see on the front, the main design feature that this lens has over this one is that it has two rings. So it has a dedicated manual focus ring and then a dedicated control ring as well. So if you want to quickly switch to manual mode on the RF 35mm, you switch over and then it's manual mode. And then you've also got the control ring as well, that whatever if you set that on your camera or not, it depends, it's whatever you do. If you don't use it, you don't use it. But then it's also got another switch here, whereas the other one don't, for image stabilization. Now, this is where the price and also the weight and the size of it comes into play as well, because of this lens has image stabilization. That reason alone was one of the biggest reasons why I actually picked this lens up before I picked up the 50mm, because I really wanted that image stabilization for photo, but mainly for video. Now, that's one of the big differences as well between these two lenses. The other one is that this actually has a macro mode to it. Now, it's not true macro or 1:1, it's a 1:2, and because it's a 35mm, it's a little bit weird compared to using a telephoto lens. So it's nowhere near going to be as good as a true dedicated 100mm macro lens 1:1, but you can still get quite up close with this lens, and that's another thing what I like for it for video, because I can get up close and personal with my subject for like product photography, for example. If I was actually going to be recording some B-roll for the 50mm, I'll probably be using this lens to actually get up close into the details of it as well. They're the two main differences between these two lenses, is that this has a macro mode and that it also has image stabilization. Now, how big a deal is that to you? To be honest, it was quite a big deal to me, mainly the image stabilization. The macro mode is handy as well, but is that enough for you to pay the extra money for the 35 over the 50mm? Now, the design of the actual 50mm itself is that it's just got one ring, and that's a control and focus ring itself. So as you can see on the app switch on the actual lens itself, it says focus and control. Now, I keep mine on control, obviously, unless I'm going to use manual mode. If you switch it straight to focus, it doesn't manual focus. Now, the annoying thing about this lens is you actually have to go into the menus of the actual camera itself and then change it from autofocus to manual focus. Now, that can be annoying, constantly changing it if you want to only get a quick manual mode shot and then a quick auto shot. That's actually annoying compared to actually just switching it to manual mode on this lens here. So bear that in mind if you want to keep switching that. But I guess it keeps the size of it really down, considering it only has one ring and one switch. So that can be a pro as well, because of how small and light it actually is. Both of these lenses have a metal lens mount, as like all the RF lenses that they have now, which is really good, instead of a plastic one. The 35mm has a 52mm thread, and the 50mm has a 43mm thread. So if you are going to get any filters and these are only your lenses, get the filters for the bigger one, just so it works better for the smaller one. Also, on both of these lenses, the barrel of the lens actually comes out. So when you're focusing and that, it comes in and out, And I must say, for photo, this 35mm is really loud when it is focusing. For video, it slightly quietens down a little bit. The 50mm is a little bit similar, but not as bad. But the 35mm is really loud when you are focusing. Both of them, though, really super fast autofocus. The RF lenses are amazing at autofocus, obviously with the new bodies as well and the autofocus in there. Autofocus on both of these lenses are absolutely amazing, so you'd have nothing to worry about there. They're basically the exact same. I will talk about the price differences between these two lenses at the end of the video after actually comparing with photography and videography. But if you are interested, I will leave the link in the description for both of these lenses down below if you wanted to go pick them up and if you are interested, because both of these lenses are really good. But now we've got that out of the way, let's talk about and actually compare the photography side of both of these lenses. Now both of them open up to f1.8 and both of them are really sharp. Obviously with this lens here, you can actually got image stabilization, so you can actually stop down the shutter speed to maybe 1/30th of a second to let a little bit more light in, whereas this one you can't. I'd say minimum 1/60th of a second if you're really still for handheld shooting, obviously because there's no image stabilization. And if you've got something like the EOS R that don't have any in-body stabilization, then it's going to be a little bit shaky and you might get some blurry images when you do shoot at low shutter speed. So even though it does open up to f1.8, which is really good in low light, you still might want to lower that a little bit more if you're shooting in a higher f-stop or if it's really dark outside anyway. So bear that in mind, is that the image stabilization does come in handy when you do want to shoot at them low shutter speeds. Both of these lenses are really sharp, and I'll show some photos that I've actually taken over the top of this video now as I'm talking, and I'll show you comparing them, the differences, and both of them are really good. They're really sharp. I love using both of them, and you won't actually think there's a big difference between 35mm and a 50mm, but trust me, there actually really is. The 35mm I love it for basically all types of photography really. You can shoot stunning landscapes with it, you can shoot amazing portraits, especially when you open it up to f1.8. Get some portraits with a little bit of scene in, not too much where it distorts it or anything, but you can basically take some portraits where and showing off the scene so you actually know whereabouts you are. So if you're at a beach or something, you can still get that nice shallow depth of field, but then you can also show off the scene of the actual place where you're at as well when you're actually using this lens. Whereas the 50mm is a little bit more compressed and it doesn't show off the scene as much. So a lot of people say a 50mm is the perfect portrait lens because you can really separate the subject from the background a lot more than you can with a 35mm. So it depends what one you really go on. That's why I say it's good to have both of these lenses, because instead of just having a zoom lens like an f2.8 lens where you've got both of these, like a 24-70 where you have both of these focal lengths in it, but by having two of these primes, both of them open up at f1.8, so you can get that beautiful shallow depth of field when you're using both of these lenses, and you can get two different perspectives. Even though there's a 15mm difference between these two lenses, there is a big difference when you actually are taking photos. So you can really get creative with both of these lenses. I think both of these lenses are great for all types of photography. I'm mainly going to be using these for car shoots, for portraits, pet portraits, and both of them for landscapes as well, but I'll mainly use the 35mm for landscapes. But if I want to get anything like subject based, like maybe product shoots or anything like that, then maybe I'll use the 50mm just to get that little bit more compression. But if I do want to show the scenery a little bit more, I will use the 35mm. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is that both of these are not weather sealed. Comparing them really doesn't really do it justice, because I genuinely think you should have both of these lenses, because even if you'd rather this lens like I did last year, I still wanted this lens, especially because of the focal length difference. This lens is priced super cheap compared to all these other lenses, even compared to this lens. But are the features in this lens big enough for you? Well, speaking in the videography terms now, image stabilization comes in a big difference when you're talking about these lenses for video, because that is where you get real nice stabilized footage, especially handheld. Even with the EOS R at the minute, if I shoot in like 60 frames per second with this lens, I'm shooting handheld with no image stabilization in EOS R. It might be a little bit shaky, but it's still nice and smooth, especially when I slow it down. It's really smooth. However, it's going to be a little bit harder to get them smooth shots with the 50mm because there's no image stabilization in it or in the EOS R. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get them smooth shots. I'll probably be using my gimbal with this lens a lot more than I do with this lens, even though I love using this on the gimbal as well, but mainly because this hasn't got image stabilization. If I'm ever out in the field and I haven't got my gimbal and I want to get some B-roll, I'll be choosing this lens every time over this one, because I don't want a shaky footage without the image stabilization. For video, both of these lenses are really good, but I must say the RF 35mm takes the crown on this competition because of that image stabilization, and also with that macro mode as well makes a big difference because you can get really up close and personal. But obviously them two main features are going to come at a price, and it does come at a big price. The asking price of the Canon 35mm RF is about £529 brand new. Compare that to the RF 50mm, you can pick it up for about £180 to £220 depending on where you're looking. It's over double the price of the 50mm. Is that a big enough difference for you? Will you be taking advantage of the image stabilization and the macro mode and the dedicated focus ring and a dedicated control ring to be worth the money? I know you might want a dedicated 35mm prime lens, and that might be worth the money for you anyway because you might just want the 35mm. So I would say if you're a videographer who was looking for a fast prime lens, I must say I'll suggest you go for the 35mm. However, if we're talking on the photography side here, the image stabilization doesn't really matter too much over the 50mm because they open up so wide anyway, so you might not need to lower the shutter speed too much. And if you do, you can just slap an ND filter on or put it on a tripod. I'm not really going to say the macro mode's amazing for photography either. I much prefer it for video. So for photography, it just depends. What focal length do you prefer? Do you prefer 50mm to get a little bit more compressed, or do you prefer a 35mm to show a little bit more of the scene? I think these perform just as good as each other. The sharpness is amazing between both of them, and at the end of the day, it just comes down what focal length you prefer. So I suggest you pick up both of them for photography. Overall, I'd say I'm not going to recommend either one over the other because I think you should have both. Even though this lens is a lot better at video than this lens is less than half price than this lens, so it's a lot cheaper. So if you want a budget and you're mainly a photographer, then grab this lens. However, if you want to do a video more, you like a 35mm more, then pick up this lens. I will leave the link in the description, like I mentioned earlier, below if you want to go pick them both up, because I really do highly suggest you do. If you did enjoy this video, you might enjoy these other 4 videos that I've actually done on the Canon lenses and bodies, so make sure you go watch them after this video. And if you did enjoy, hit that like button and subscribe to see more videos like this in the future, and I'll see you guys on the next video. See you later. Or if you should get both.